I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine, discuss diplomatic updates from the EU and the US, and we interview John Foreman, former British defence attache to Moscow and, at a different time, to Kyiv. We talk about the Russian war machine, the fight for the Black Sea, and the challenges facing both armies in the months and years ahead.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 19th of March, 2 years and 24 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and our guest is John Foreman, former British defence attaché and Royal Navy officer. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
So let's start, not quite in Ukraine actually. This action is still continuing down in the border region, where Ukraine-Russia border region. Russian volunteers fighting for Ukraine say they have destroyed an ammunition depot in the border village of Tekhino. That's right on the border in the Kursk region, about 40 km northwest of Sumy. Drone footage posted on social media shows smoke rising from a warehouse after it's been reportedly hit by artillery, and then a second strike absolutely destroys the building. The Freedom of Russia Legion posted on Telegram, "We destroyed the ammunition depot of Putin's army in Tekhino, to be continued." Now, they are one of just of several pro-Kyiv groups currently involved in cross-border raids inside the Russian border regions of Kursk and Belgorod. Aside from the Freedom of Russia Legion, there's also the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Siberian Battalion, and the Ichkerian Volunteers. I've not heard of the last one, so I may well have mispronounced that, and I need to look into them. Speaking of the Siberian Battalion, the group claims to have raised its flag in the village of Kozinka. That's in Belgorod region, again right on the border, but this time about 75 km southeast of Sumy. They've been fighting there alongside the Russian Volunteer Corps, they say. Now, the groups posted an image of them holding up their flags, posted on Telegram, and there were reports of volunteer groups also active in the village of Gorkovsky. That's 16 to 20 k's further east, but that's just across a sort of bulge in the border. So even though it's a bit further to the east, it's only a couple of k's from the border with Ukraine. Now, TASS, the Russian state-owned media agency, says shelling in the region this morning injured 3 people and had left the whole border district without power. Putin yesterday admitted that the pro-Ukrainian volunteer forces that are thought to be made up just of Russian citizens. I mean, there's a lot about this we don't know, so forgive me for sounding a bit unsure about quite a lot of it. But Putin said they're composed of Russian citizens and said that there are 4 groups of traitors conducting cross-border raids into Russia. He insinuated that Russia is going to find them and execute them. But more on what Putin had to say yesterday shortly from Francis, what's left of him. More of that later. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed these limited ground attacks were continuing. The Russian MOD, they have reportedly added a section to their daily situational report to commanders to account for what they call the Belgorod direction. That suggests some concern at a very high level regarding how these cross-border raids are going to be dealt with and what they mean. In response to them, we think about 9,000 children, or we know 9,000 children are said to be evacuated from the Belgorod region. The plans are in place. This comes from the local governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov. He said the first group of about 1,200 children will be moved on Friday. As a reminder, pro-Russian all-Ukrainian volunteer forces conducted isolated cross-border raids into Belgorod Oblast on March the 22nd, June the 1st, and overnight June 4th, 5th last year. The ISW, Institute for the Study of War, think tank in the US, say the previous raids appear to have been more limited than the ones going on right now. These current ones, we think, started on March the 12th. So last week, a week today, is seen to be the start of it. And they've continued every day since. So they are going on for longer and seem to be more expansive in the geographic areas covered. So we'll be talking about that again. Now, the next one. Inside Ukraine, Russian forces struck the city of Kherson and 8 more settlements in the region, killing 3 people. Alexander Prokudin, the local governor, said. There were also deaths and injuries in Donetsk region, in the area about 15 k's northwest of Avdiivka. The regional governor there, Vadim Filashkin, said that on Facebook. And Russia has targeted a total of 9 Ukrainian regions: Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, Mykolaiv, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, Kherson, Kharkiv and Donetsk overnight, with casualties reported in the latter 3. There's been limited movement across the line, a few hundreds of metres, if that, but all heading west in Russia's desired direction. Now, the next one. Alexander Syrsky, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, he has said that developing drones is key to giving Kyiv an advantage over the numerically superior Russian forces. He said, this is a bit of a clunky quote, "The development of the use of unmanned systems is my priority. We are looking for asymmetric solutions to gain a qualitative advantage over a numerically superior opponent." Looking for clever stuff, basically. You'll remember, as part of his recent military reforms, President Zelensky last month ordered the creation of a new branch, a separate branch of Ukraine's armed forces, to be devoted to drones. I've been looking into this, but I've not yet been able to work out whether this new drone, I can't remember the name of the formation, but basically this drone force is in effect a massive warehouse of drones into which military formations can go in and say, right, I need 500 drones for 2 days or what have you, or whether this formation is a fighting force in its own right and will be what the British military call task organised, task orged. You take a chunk of drones and you would give them infantry and armour and engineers and signals and all the rest of it and say, right, go and do this mission. So we're not quite worked out yet if it's more a logistic element or an actual fighting force, but trying to keep an eye on it. You'll remember also that Britain, the UK here, has championed the formation of a drone coalition under which it pledged to deliver 10,000 drones throughout this year. I think they announced that, well, UK announced it a couple of weeks ago. 10,000 drones, not of various flavours: intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, attack, etc. But probably not going to survive more than a couple of months on the current attritional rate. And now, just finally for me, the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, the Ramstein process, as it's known, is currently underway today, now, at the US Air Force Base in Germany, from which the process gets its name. Opening the comments at Ramstein, the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin said the US, the coalition and the free world, quote, will not let Ukraine fail. He said the group consisted of countries of conscience and said every pledge of military aid to Ukraine was an investment in our shared security. He praised the 8 capability coalitions, the one I mentioned just now, led by the UK on drones, but there's also capability coalitions for artillery, fighter jets, demining. He said, as Lloyd Austin said, we will all be less secure if Putin gets his way. Ukraine is one of the great causes of our time. Let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. Now, at today's meeting, news just coming out in the last hour, Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius, he announced a new military aid package worth about 500 million euros. This package will include 10,000 155mm artillery shells from existing Bundeswehr stocks, so the German army stocks. Also, 180,000 155mm shells through the Czech-led initiative. Peter Pavel, the president of Czechia, he's leading that side of it, that capability coalition into artillery ammunition. And also this is also from Boris Pistorius, another 100,000 155mm shells throughout the rest of this year. They're going to be newly ordered by Germany for delivery throughout the year. So those 100,000 and the 180,000 via the Czech initiative are over the next few months. But Boris Pistorius said delivery of the 10,000 from the shelves of the Bundeswehr would begin almost immediately. We think Ukraine is firing about 2,000 155mm shells a day, as against sort of 6,000 to 8,000-ish from Russia. So you can do the maths. That's a week's worth of, or 5 days worth of artillery, which is good. But, hey, let's get the other stuff going. And then just finally on capability coalitions, Germany and Poland have agreed to form an armoured vehicles coalition. Polish Defence Minister Władysław Koźniak-Kamysz said yesterday, following talks in Warsaw with Boris Pistorius, his German counterpart, this group will officially begin operations next Tuesday. So let's see what happens next Tuesday with hopefully a load of armoured vehicles. But that's us up to date, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. Francis Dearnley, welcome back. Would you like to talk us through what's been on your desk this morning?
Well, thanks, David. It's good to be on. It was looking a bit dicey for a while. One day on from Putin's sham election result, it's been interesting to register which countries have congratulated him on his victory and which have held their tongue. As The Guardian rather succinctly put it today, comments from leaders across Europe and the US stood in sharp contrast to messages of congratulation that flowed from countries across Asia, Africa and Latin America. These contrasting reactions underscore the geopolitical fault lines that have been cleaved wider since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, triggering a crisis in relations with the West. Iran, North Korea and others are all cock-a-hoop today. China's Xi was quick out of the blocks too, saying Beijing would continue to promote the No Limits partnership, as was India's Prime Minister Modi, saying that he looked forward to strengthening New Delhi's time-tested, special and privileged strategic partnership with Moscow. Now, this one seems to have surprised many people, but not us or our listeners. We've been talking ever since the full-scale invasion as to the positioning of India when it comes to Russia and the West. They have benefited substantially from disruption to the global energy market in response to the war. It is also important not to read this as being an appeal from India to all autocracies, as they remain extremely concerned about China. Yet even so, I think when you even have the leader of the world's largest democracy congratulating a dictator for their re-election, it is rather concerning given the present context. Pope Francis has apparently also congratulated Putin on his victory. Inevitably, as all leaders do when riding high after a successful election, real or not, Putin has been emboldened, now saying that he wants to create a buffer zone in Ukraine to protect Russia from long-range Western weapons. He suggested the occupied belt of land would be deep enough into Ukrainian territory that it would be quite difficult to penetrate using the foreign-made strike assets at the enemy's disposal. Now, I find this very interesting. Does he just mean in the short term, calling on the armed forces to cut deeper into the country and stop embarrassing attacks on Russian soil? Or could this be the new argument used for trying to win around Westerners to his cause, just as the NATO encroachment argument was? Effectively saying, I need to keep the occupied territories to stop the Ukrainians being able to hit Russia with missiles. It's only fair. It's possible. It's also has an interesting, important historical resonance for anyone who's familiar with the Cold War. Stalin's justification, too, for the seizure of vast swathes of Eastern Europe was the need for buffer zones to maintain Soviet security. He believed that establishing a buffer of friendly states around the Soviet Union would provide protection from potential invasion and serve as that strategic barrier against Western powers. Following Operation Barbarossa in 1941 and the attacks by Nazi forces on Moscow and Leningrad, this did have a powerful resonance at the time, even though it was the Ukrainians who, of course, suffered worst, statistically speaking, by the German invasion of the Soviet Union, as we've discussed in earlier episodes. Equally worrying are Putin's remarks yesterday at a concert on Red Square to celebrate 10 years since invading Crimea. Hand in hand, we will move forward, and this will make us stronger. Long live Russia, Putin told the crowd. He then boasted of a new rail link in areas of Ukraine captured by Russian forces, saying those regions had declared their desire to return to their native family. Again, that appeal to this idea of kinship between the Russian and Ukrainian people, as if they are one people. He appeared at the concert alongside the three candidates who ran against him after hosting them at a Kremlin meeting in which they all congratulated him, very revealing as to the true nature of those candidates. Turning to the EU now, some strong condemnations from within the bloc on Putin's so-called victory, with some even louder calls for more to be done in response to Russian aggression. Europe must shift to a war economy and significantly bolster its defence capabilities, Charles Michel, the European Council President, said. If we want peace, we must prepare for war, he wrote in an op-ed published by several newspapers. Another Batesius reference, I think, what was it in Latin? Si visi pacem parabellum? Not sure, Don, do you know? Is that one of the ones on the army emblems?
Yeah, something like that.
We love to hear it. But I digress. Russia is a serious military threat to our European continent and global security. That is coming from Michel again. We must therefore be defence ready and shift to a war economy mode. The EU is preparing to levy taxes on grain imports from Russia and Belarus to placate farmers and some member states. Well, very welcome, no doubt, Mr. Michel, but why has it taken so long for us to be getting around to doing that, given the perilous state in which we find ourselves? Dom already mentioned the strong words too coming out from the United States, saying that the United States will not let Ukraine fail. But, of course, this is not something that America necessarily promise, given the precarious state over there with the Republicans. All eyes are on Trump to see what he might say about Putin's sham elections, of course, in a sign of just how chaotic his messaging can be. Trump said that Putin was probably involved in the death of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny. Here's what he said, and I quote, "I don't know, but perhaps, I mean possibly, I could say probably, I don't know." Glad we cleared that up. But to return to the EU, negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the bloc can start in the first half of 2024, Ukraine's Prime Minister has said. The European Commission on March 12th proposed a draft framework for membership talks with Ukraine and Moldova, of course another candidate to join the bloc. We hope that our European partners will approve it without any additional amendments as the European Commission proposes, he said. Of course, it's going to be a very long road for EU membership for Ukraine, but the significance of these talks being formally begun shouldn't be underestimated. Imagine if they'd gone the other way and how isolated geopolitically Ukraine would feel. Things at the moment are not going in the most favourable direction for Ukraine on the battlefield. I think that's no surprise. And yet in the geopolitical arena, it's really, really important, I think, to see how now closely bound to the Western security apparatus that Kyiv has become, as well as symbolically part of the European political bloc, whether inside or outside of the European Union. Ukraine is now part of the European family of nations, and I don't think that anything is going to be able to sever that, whatever Putin says. But that's where we are, David, today.
Well, thank you very much, Francis Dearnley and Dom Nicholls, for all of that. John Foreman, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Would you start just by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about your career before we get into the questions?
Well, sure. Thank you, David. And thank you, Francis and Dom, for the introduction. I think I last saw Dom in Moscow about 2 years ago, just before the invasion. So I'm a career naval officer. I spent 40 years in the Royal Navy, and I spent about 20 years of that doing sort of normal naval duties. And then the second 20 years, I was fundamentally abroad. So I worked at the Pentagon for 3 years. I was the defense attache in Kyiv. I worked at coalition in the Gulf. I was with NATO. Then I went to the European Union, the dog days of our membership. And then I went to Moscow 2019 to 2022 as defense attache.
Well, let's start then in Russia. Let's talk about the Russian army. Far from crumbling, as some people may have predicted after the successful Ukrainian counteroffensives in the east of the country, which feel like years ago now, the forces come back, rebuilt, and come back, it seems, stronger. Could you, John, just explain to us how it's managed to do that?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of those commentary about, in the wake of Kharkiv and Kherson, there was lots of wishful thinking that this was the beginning of the end, that one last push by the Ukrainians would leave the Russians crumbling and be forced out of Ukraine. I think the process of rebuilding started at the end of 2022. Firstly, when you got Surovikin was made commander, and then he was replaced by Gerasimov. And our friend Dominic Cummings is quite prone to mentioning the phrase people, ideas and machines in that order. So I think Russia has, on people, sacked or replaced a huge amount of its leaders in the field. I've just seen admirals replace the Black Sea and the head of the Navy. plus a whole new crop of hungrier generals have come up through the ranks, replacing those commanders who were in the place at the beginning of the invasion. Plus, of course, Russia's managed to find a whole bunch of troops, whether they're convicts or volunteers, or as we saw on Sky today, Nepalese and Indians, etc. I think also on ideas, I think Russia moved to the strategic defensive at the end of 2022. Remember the whole business about Surovikin lines. And there's more realism on its military objectives, so that's why they withdrew over the river from Kherson and dug in and blunted the Ukrainian offensive last year. So I think they were encouraged by that failure of the Ukrainian offensive. And now we've seen them adapting new tactics in the field in terms of storm tactics to grind their way forward yard by yard and body by body in Donbass. And I think also on the machines side, I think Russia's also adapted. We see more growth of UAVs, increase of accuracy, reducing the time between sensors and shooters to get more rounds on target more quickly. We see the military-industrial complex ramp up, and of course we've seen support from North Korea and Iran. So, plus a huge dollop of cash from the government, huge presidential and bureaucratic focus. I think that rebuilding process is not completed, but I think they've come a long way since the dog days of 2022, when I think they were almost a militia rather than an army.
Could we go into detail on some of those things you just said, John? You mentioned there the sort of, on the tactical level, the changes, and you talked about the storm sort of units, the assault units that will be going forward and taking those extra metres of ground. What do we know of how those tactics have changed in the Russian army throughout the full-scale invasion?
Yeah, I think originally, back in 2022, I think the Russian army had an image of itself as the successors of Zhukov and the Red Army, that there would be these combined armed tactics using armoured vehicles, and then the army would punch its way through and be in Kiev in 3 days. And obviously, as that failed, and as the war got reduced down to an attritional battle, I think Russia dug out some of its old lessons from the World War II about how to more to do with trench warfare. And as the war became a battle of kilometres to tens of kilometres to metres, and now matter inches, the tactics evolved as well. So I think on storming tactics, they've combined elite forces, regular army, and volunteers and mercenaries and cheaper troops with less value to storm forward, to grab the land and then reinforce it. I think that's the tactics they were using in Avdiivka and Bakhmut when Prigozhin was in charge of Wagner.
Talking about doctrine, something we did an interview many months ago now with the Institute for the Study of War, and one of the things they said about the Russian tactics and strategy over the past year was how, in their digging in the south and in their conduct of operations, they said that it was almost a sort of, it was a very effective use of classic doctrine, digging in hard, concentration of forces, that kind of thing. Do you think that's, how far do you agree with that, and do you think maybe that doctrine has evolved slightly? And I'd be interested if you think so, how so?
I think they've really gone back to their basics. At the beginning of the war, I wrote a thing in the first months of the invasion for the ministers, and it seemed to me that the Russians had abandoned their principles of war, and that the sort of the chaos in command, the confusion between different units, the lack of preparation, the lack of reconnaissance, the lack of concentration of force had all been abandoned. Had all happened because their principles of war had been abandoned. And I think the sort of sense of Gerasimov bringing things back to basics at the end of 2022, beginning of 23, saw them dust off some of the things they were used to. And that's not just me saying, that's also what Russian experts have been saying, that Russia's much more happy on the strategic defensive. That's the basis of their entire military doctrine. And that you're seeing that debate play through in authoritative journals in Moscow at the moment, that the focus is on defense, or active defense, the Russians put it, having a solid baseline with which to then continue military operations. So both Shoigu and Gerasimov have used the active defence word within the last 2 months. And I think that's a sense of not reinventing the wheel, going back to 1970s and 80s and Soviet doctrine, which is very much in the mind of people like Gerasimov, has seen some results on the battlefield.
How do you think the way the Russians have dealt with their problems compares with the Ukrainians?
Well, I think the Ukrainians are also on a journey of reorganisation and rebooting their armed forces. Obviously, the immediate priority in 2022 was to blunt the Russian offensive, and they managed that, although I think it was a very close run thing. I think in 2023, the focus was on the offensive, which unfortunately failed and didn't gain the territory that Ukraine wanted. So I think now you're seeing that adaptation, which the Russians have been going through, also happening on the Ukrainian side. So as we've seen, General Zaluzhny was replaced, the previous Ukrainian Minister of Defense was replaced. There's been a whole suite of new, hungrier, younger Ukrainian generals coming through who've proven themselves on the battlefield. And I think Zelensky's placed on Syrskyi, the new Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, a whole set of tasks, improving logistics, improving training, having an actual plan for the whole year rather than bit by bit offensives, rotation of troops, UAVs, which Dominic mentioned, sharing of lessons and improving training at the formation level rather than just the tactical level. At the same time, I think the Ukrainians are also learning the lessons of their offensive for how they want to go forward, notably they're on the defensive at the moment. And I think on the equipment, as Dominic mentioned, there's much focused on quality of equipment rather than just quantity, in particular asymmetric. So if the Russians are there with good quantitative superiority, then the Ukrainians want to seek qualitative superiority over the Russians.
Could we look quickly at the Black Sea? I've got many questions about this, and I think you're almost the perfect person to answer them. How important is that theatre to the war as a whole? And why do you think the Russians have not been, well, seemingly not been able to innovate and stay ahead of the Ukrainians here? I mean, we've seen quite a lot of the Black Sea fleet attacked and sunk, and they don't seem to be able to protect their ships in a way that on land it feels like they are innovating. They are keeping up with the Ukrainians and in some cases getting ahead of them. Why do you think that's the case?
So firstly on its importance, I mean, obviously any theatre in warfare is going to be important, but I've always thought that the Black Sea theatre is a supporting effort to the main effort, which is on the land, and where the war will be decided will be on the land, not at sea. So we have seen some success. Obviously, the grain exports. Odessa is now safe. Russia's ceded maritime control of half of the Black Sea, and the Ukrainian attacks in the whole theatre, both on land and at sea, have made the problem of rearmament, resupply, and repair of Russian ships more difficult. As we've seen, the Black Sea Fleet commander has now been sacked. The head of the Navy has, quote, resigned, and there's much more effective Northern Fleet being brought in. I think the difficulty of the Russian fleet to innovate comes back to that intellectual rigidity and the fact that the Russian Navy is subordinate to the Russian army. So the Ukrainians have been attacking Russian ships with these unmanned sea vehicles for over a year. The Royal Navy and the US Navy have been confronting the small boat threat for decades. And it's taken Shoigu to go down to Sevastopol and tell the new head of the Navy that they must be working day and night to fend off attacks. And I think there's a sense of ploddiness, rigidity, inability to innovate has been particularly concentrated in the Black Sea Fleet, which is always seen as a bit of a backwater within the Russian Navy. I think they've just underestimated the Ukrainians' ingenuity and the threat they represent. They've overestimated their own capabilities, and they've paid a high price. Over 30% of the ships sunk or damaged. And I think the blow to their prestige has also been dramatic.
It's just a thought that's occurred to me, John, but do you think as well there's an issue here that at sea, the Russian superiority in terms of numbers doesn't mean anything? You can't deploy more sailors unless you have the gear. In a sense, it's all about the gear, it's all about the kit, and there the Ukrainians do have the advantage. Is that fair?
The Russians set out to establish sea control in the Black Sea, and the classic counter to that by a navy inferior in numbers is to adopt a sea denial. If you can't control the sea yourself, deny it to somebody else. So the combination of mines, missiles against Moscow, these small vehicles, missile strikes into Crimea, taking out of naval aviation, missiling the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, damaging the docks, targeting amphibious ships, has been a carefully crafted and wise strategy, rather than trying to take on the Russian Navy one-on-one, toe-to-toe, to do it asymmetrically. So that sort of asymmetry that Syrskyi's talking about. I think it's that sort of approach he wants to get across the Ukrainian armed forces. But I also think the Russian size, its lack of training, the fact it was always seen as a bit of a backwater has been shown up. I wouldn't transfer that lesson directly across to other parts of the Russian Navy, in particular the Northern Fleet.
No, that's really fascinating. Thank you so much, John. Just zooming out then and maybe looking ahead, what do you think for both sides are the major issues and challenges they're going to face in the months and maybe even years ahead?
Well, I think we spoke about it, about my worries. I think my immediate worry is the Russian army grinding forward in Donbass. And I looked at the figures this morning. So Russia occupies 90% of Luhansk, 57% of Donetsk, and 70% of Zaporizhia oblasts. And going back to the elections and what Putin's been saying, he's been very much focused on the Donbass at present. And I think that's his priority, to grind out a victory there. Now, I don't think that he'll be able to, the Russian army is capable of doing a massive, dramatic breakout, but I think it is quite capable of grinding forward day by day, especially at the moment with the uncertainty of Ukrainian arms. I just heard that Putin's been claiming that people in the occupied Ukrainian territories are actually Russian, but I'm also concerned about the continued attacks by the Russians on Ukrainian cities and on Ukrainian key infrastructure. But if you've said to me, my greater concern, even beyond that, is the fate of the people in the occupied territories. We've seen Putin mentioning building new railways through Donbass to actually link it up with Russia. That would this process of assimilation or connecting is ongoing, not only to military purposes, but also the eradication of the Ukrainian identities down there, all of which is enabled by the Russian army. I think on the Ukrainian side, I think things are very difficult. I think the Secretary Austin was talking about today. I think I generally wish, at the same time as Ukraine is reorganizing and focusing itself for the future, I want less platitudes and more guns. Or if you say to the Speaker of the House in Washington, praise God by all means, but pass the ammunition.
Just before I pass the microphone to Francis and Dom, just one more question from me, John. You mentioned there the Russian election. Did anything surprise you about it? And do you think it can tell us anything about Putin's popularity with ordinary people?
Well, I think the ludicrous nature of the 88% winning mark was a surprise. I thought they were cannier than that, and sort of giving a sort of false sense of legitimacy would go for something like in the low 80s. I think somebody else mentioned that in the last four elections, it's gone 60%, 70%, now 80%, and gives space in 6 years' time for Putin to go the full 90%. But increasingly, he's going the full Mugabe. He's still some way off Saddam, who used to get 100%. But I think that sense of overplaying the numbers opened up many eyes on the West and elsewhere to the level of dictatorship now in Russia. And that the pantomime of the farcical nature of these elections was a surprise to me, even by Russian standards. And I was there for the last elections in 2020. Just on implications, I think the key issue for me is, are there any cabinet changes, especially those inner people in his inner core? So people like Lavrov, who's 74, Bortnikov, his early 70s, head of the FSB. He's apparently sick. Patrushev, the head of the National Security Council, himself is over 70s. And Shoigu, although he was looking sprightly the other day in Sevastopol, he's 68. He's spoken before about going off to rebuild Siberia. So I think there's that sense of whether he'll stick with its existing team or will he go for a newer, hungrier generation with the risks that brings, but also some rewards and perhaps part of baking his legacy and bring on a new generation to eventually hand over power in due course. And I think if Shoigu goes, then Gerasimov goes. They tend to be, these things in the Russian system tend to be a double act. So if Shoigu goes, who would be the next chief of general staff, who's a general who's proved himself in the field? And back to your first point, I don't think the elections show anything about the level of real support for Putin amongst the Russian population. It's a full-on dictatorship. He's sent his message to the elites, his enemies abroad and at home, that he's in power and that we're going to have more war and no peace, and that war is the defining issue. This war is the defining issue of his rule power or his misrule of Russia.
Well, thank you so much, John. I'll hand over now to Dom first, I think, who I know has some questions. Dom Nicholls.
Thanks, David, and welcome again, John. It's good to hear from you. Seems a very long time ago when we met in Moscow. I think 10 days before the start of the full-scale invasion. I used the expression recently. We were talking to a guest. I invited them to take us behind the scenes of their particular area of expertise, and I used the expression "open the kimono," which I picked up from somewhere around on my travel, God knows where. But I then looked over at Francis Dearnley, and it just caused all sorts of conniptions here in the studio. And in fact, it wouldn't be a kimono. Say Francis, it would be a hospital gown. But more of that later. But John, I'm thinking about today's the Ramstein meeting, the Ukraine Defence Contact Group going on in the Ramstein Air Base. Can you talk us through that, your views on what would be happening on the defence attaché circuit? What kind of conversations would have happened in the run up to this, and now the principals are all in the room and they're chatting away? Do all the attachés go off for a nice long lunch, or is this just the start of their work? What kind of diplomacy would have happened in the background and would be carrying on a day-to-day basis between these groups? From the if you can put one of your many defence attaché hats on, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my most recent defence attaché experience is very different from the ones which my colleagues around Europe or for the countries involved with the Ramstein conference will be engaged with. But I think that all these things are pre-cooked before the meeting. There's very little left to doubt when Mr. Wallace sits down or Mr. Schaap sits down with Secretary Austin and the other leaders and the Ukrainians. So we know the Ukrainian wish list. We know what the supply is. And I think the role of officials, I'm not saying defence attachés and diplomats, and through the NATO organisations, bilaterally and multilaterally, is to line up what commitments people are going to make against what the requirement is from the Ukrainian side. And that process starts from the beginning, immediately after the previous meeting. So on one side, you'll have the Ukrainians asking for a lot, and then nations will look at what they've already committed in the political situation. And the idea will be to give, I imagine, a broad balance of capabilities against the Ukrainian wish list, noting that Ukraine won't get everything it asks for. That's just the way that things, because of capacity and concerns over national defences. I think on the Ramstein process, what was interesting for me is Austin's words. He slightly slammed Macron's attempts to place European security or the European Union in this process. The requirements for Ukrainian arms and support come via NATO through the Ramstein process. And what we don't want is other organisations popping up and trying to do their own thing. And perhaps leading to confusion for the Ukrainians trying to suck up two different processes. But I think that diplomacy, military diplomacy in the background, is an important sort of grease in the pump to make all this happen. But I think we're now 2 years into it, so I imagine the process runs pretty smoothly.
And just on the sort of human side of these things, how important is it to actually be in the room, to have face-to-face meetings? Because we could all do this via video conference and so on and so forth. But in this day and age, 21st century, how much extra special sauce do you get from these kind of meetings by actually being there to see your opposite numbers and to literally break bread with them?
Well, I think it's diplomacy is a face-to-face, very human activity. I mean, that's the value added you get for having diplomats and attachés and meetings at the highest level. Something you can't get by sending emails or strongly worded letters or face-to-face. You just don't get the same reaction. And going back to when you were in Moscow, the reason Mr. Wallace and Radakin went was to be able to sit down with Shoigu and Gerasimov face-to-face in a small room and actually talk seriously 3 feet away from each other, rather than just broadcasting each other by press releases and strongly worded statements on Twitter. And I think there's no substitute for that. And I think that's what makes diplomacy, even my small part of it, absolutely crucial. But it complements other forms of engagement rather than replaces them.
Thanks. And just one final one for me, if I may, before I hand over to the English patient. You talked earlier on, you mentioned sea control a bit earlier. Do you think we're learning anything new from what's happening in the Black Sea with Ukraine's use of autonomous vehicles, the sea drones? Or is this just the same old thing that we've seen throughout history? And just would you mind just including for our listeners and myself what we mean by sea control and sea denial, please?
Sure. Well, sea control, in terms of being a blue water, the Royal Navy, is our ability to execute the tasks we want to do without being interfered with by the enemy. So in lead up to 1944 and D-Day landings, the Allies established sea control in the English Channel to ensure that the landing ships could go across from the UK across to France unimpeded. And we did the same in the air, as we've just seen in the excellent Masters of the Air series on Apple TV. I think in terms of tactics, equipment, as I said, we've been confronted the Iranian Boghammer threat back in the 80s. I remember doing drills off the south coast of England being bounced by small ships coming towards you and then having to react quite quickly day and night. And we sort of adapt our tactics using helicopters and surface ships and up-arming our ships and also improving our warning time, so these boats could be taken out more quickly. And you've seen how the Americans and the British have dealt with the Houthi threat in the Red Sea at present. I think the thing that's new, and I had an argument with somebody about this, is we've been fighting fire ships in the anchorages since the Spanish Armada, but I think it's the use of stealth, the sort of low observable nature of these things, the range of these uncrewed vehicles, and also if you link that with artificial intelligence, ability to target individual units autonomously from a long distance. I mean, these things are ranging several hundred kilometres out from the Black Sea. They're not just a coastal threat anymore. So it makes the commanders of the ships in the task groups afloat that have to go back further, having to layer their defence. How do we combine that with surface countermeasures, air surface countermeasures, electronic warfare, lasers, as you've seen Britain developing at present? So I think it's an evolution of an existing threat rather than a whole new threat, but something to be taken seriously.
John, thanks so much for your time today. It's Francis here. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about attitudes towards Russia that you experienced in your time as an attaché. Did you feel, knowing what we know now, that there was a general ignorance about the reality of Putin's regime at the time that you were operating in that crucial period prior to the invasion, a period that I think many historians will zoom in on and recognise as a time when there was a big ignorance institutionally in the West about the true nature of the Kremlin regime? And vice versa, did anything surprise you about the attitudes within the regime and within the Russian state that you saw about the West that made you think, crikey, they really are barking up the wrong tree here? Just very interested in your insider perspective, because of course that's something that so few people get to hear.
Sure. I think George Kennan, who's the doyen of US containment policy, once said that there is nothing so dangerous as the unknown. And I think if you look back, I joined during the Cold War, and then we had 30 years of relative peace. We disinvested our understanding of Russia. We invested in the understanding of Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq for obvious reasons, the Balkans. And it's been very difficult, I think, for some of us older greybeards to get across the fact we need to invest back into our understanding of Russia and China, these state-based threats. The institutions aren't there, the institutional knowledge isn't there. Even the people speaking Russian's not there, the PhDs aren't there. We've really taken a hit, and it's time to invest in that capacity. If we don't, then we won't understand Russia better. And I think in terms of putting that into perspective, and this is not just a British problem, it's a European American problem. If you remember in the lead up to the war, there's lots of people saying that Russia would never invade Ukraine. They were mirror imaging themselves. We know Russia because we've been trying to have a partnership with Russia since the 1990s. Putin understands that if he invades Ukraine, he's throwing away so much. He would never do it. The risks outweigh the rewards, and they were wrong. I think some of us, were right. Warning of the gathering storm. I wrote a thing to James Heapy, who's been in the news this week, or last week, in early 2020, saying that there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Russia was not changed directions. Things were getting worse day by day. And we really had to focus on defence and deterrence. Otherwise, things could get extremely bad very quickly. Now, I think our deterrence and defence of NATO was fine. But obviously, on the Ukraine, deterrence issues, efforts failed. So I think our understanding's got deeper. I still think it's quite glib. You hear things on the military side about Gerasimov doctrines and escalate to de-escalate and grey zones and hybrids and sub-thresholds, none of which are Russian terms, all of which we need to stop using. We need to focus on Russia as it is, not as we wish it to be. And conversely, I remember in 2022 being struck by Gerasimov and Shoigu's preconceptions about the threat represented to Russia by the British in particular, as was seen as being enemy number one, that we were behind the overall approach of the Americans and Ukraine towards Russia, that we had huge numbers of special forces already deployed into Ukraine, all of which was a force. So I think you have to understand that just as we have little understanding of Russia corporately, a lot of Russian senior leaders have absolutely no understanding or experience of the West. Patrushev experiences from the 80s. So is Putin's. Gerasimov served in, I think, Estonia once in the 1990s. They really don't understand us at all. And that's why it's important to have clear channels of communication, as we say, load-bearing channels of dialogue between, to try and manage the risk and to break down this misunderstanding, because it could lead to unexpected escalation.
That's really interesting, John. I wonder, it's interesting you say that for multiple reasons. One which, of course, being that we know in the Cold War, which you referenced there, that even in the 1980s, at a time when many in the West were trying to talk about de-escalating tensions with the Soviet Union, little did we know that the Soviet Union was actually believing that a first strike was more likely than ever. And indeed, there were those famous incidents in the 1980s, which we now, of course, know much more about how close we came to there being a disaster. So that's obviously not anything new, but it's extremely concerning, that knowledge gap. Just on the Cold War, as you say, this is a world that you knew and you've gone through over a long period of time, which offers you a very unique perspective. One often hears people refer to Putin's regime as reboiled Soviet Union, or he's a Red Tsar, or that he's half Hitler, half Stalin, or entirely one of those two things. What is he to you? I mean, is there a sense of this being something that we have seen before, rehashed in a slightly different way? Or is he his own entity? Is this kleptocracy something very different? And actually, when we keep harking back to these historical analogies, is it actually perhaps unhelpful?
I think we always try and find useful reference points shorthand. That, as you said, I saw Tobias Ellwood's talking on Sky TV saying that Putin was more powerful than Stalin. I don't think that's correct. Or, as you said, he's a Red Tsar. I mean, I think we should take the Putin regime on its face value rather than trying to relate it to a previous framing. But I do think there are common themes, which come out through Putin's rule about his insecurity, his expansionist tendencies, his extreme nationalism, his wish to have absolute control at home because of the threat posed, quote unquote, by the outside. His sort of tendency now to turn away and turn inwards, try and seek isolation, autarky, but that Russia's lack of allies. But I also think that Putin himself has his own motivations. It's that question: is it nature or nurture? So I think there's a whole. I read some stuff that President Nixon wrote in the 1990s when he was warning that without serious investment by the West in Russia, the democratic experiment could be lost, and that Russia would be crushed under the rubble of communism, and it would be replaced by extreme nationalism. Now, certainly in my understanding, in my experience, I don't think we've had the same level of extreme Russian nationalism in Russia since the late 19th century. And I think, as people pointed out before, he's very similar to rulers in the mid-19th century and before, where their sort of threat perceptions and personal prejudices have started to dominate reason, and he's become less rational and more irrational especially over the last 10 years.
Coming up, we hear Dom, Francis and John's final thoughts. Well, thank you very much, John, Foreman, for your time today. Thank you, Francis and Dom, for your questions too. Let's move now to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks. So I know in Putin's comments the other day, he was talking about Western military personnel apparently already operating in Ukraine, which we've spoken of before. I've said that I think they are, as in we know there's US Marines at the US Embassy and et cetera, and a few others I'm sure we've discussed. But interesting comment today from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, talking about what this means for Putin's red lines. I mean, it was apparently a red line for him, about Western boots on the ground. He's been making the point, Putin's been making the point, that Western concern over Russia's response to a crossing of this red line is baseless, that we have no right to be concerned because we've crossed the red line. I mean, it's all at sixes and sevens. It's classic sort of Russian disinformation, or take an idea and twist it into something else. However, so forget that bit for a moment, note it and move on. The ISW make the point that the Western support for, or external support for Ukraine has in the past crossed many of Putin's so-called red lines about supplying long-range ammunition and supplying tanks and all the rest of it. And of course, this has not drawn a significant Russian reaction outside of the country. So they are suggesting that many of these red lines, it's back to what Phillips O'Brien from the University of St Andrews is talking about, reflexive control. Putin keeps banging the drum about red lines the same way as he does about nuclear rhetoric, etc., hoping that we then go, oh yeah, we got to contain ourselves. We can't do that. We can't do this. And just he rattles the saber yet again, expecting and hoping that we then act accordingly. And I just suggest that we yet again hold our breath, and take it that this is a red line that is not worthy of the name, and we need to keep pushing back against this idea that Putin can set the agenda or set the parameters of the narrative in which we're allowed to discuss and act and think about these things. So yet another example here of a potential red line crossed with no consequences. I know this is dangerous talk about crossing red lines, especially when you've got a nuclear-armed state, but that's what he wants. He wants us to be able to. He wants us to enforce these on ourselves. So I think we just need to have the confidence to keep these conversations going and not shy away from, literally or in terms of discussion, crossing these red lines. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis Dearnley, would you like to address some of these scurrilous rumours and hints that Dom's been dropping as to your condition over the past over this hour?
Yes. Well, let's put the listeners out of their misery whilst mine endures. Well, very simply, my handsome face has taken a battering, dear listeners. You might hear a slight whistle in my voice. That's because I lost a tooth on Saturday when I was tripped by a rather treacherous step and managed to get knocked out for about 30 seconds. Cue a rather wild night in A&E at St Bart's Hospital in central London. I was dressed in a grey suit and had a very bloody white shirt. Shout out to Pete, who kept me company for the 3 hours whilst I was there. One can imagine what A&E is like on a Saturday night. One half expected to see Dante and Virgil strolling through on their way to the Inferno. There was one chap next to me who was shackled to a couple of police officers, and he wasn't looking too happy either. Didn't really fancy starting a conversation with him. He was looking a bit wide-eyed, shall we say. I wish the story had a bit more glamour. I wish I could say that it was caused by me getting in a scuffle with an agent sent by the FSB, but sadly, it was all my fault. So thanks for understanding if you hear my voice being a little bit whistlier than usual as I get my mouth sorted out. It's probably going to take a few weeks, but I'm okay. Just a little bit humbled by concrete.
Well, that's very good to hear. And of course, the listeners, if you wish to send any cards or flowers, do just get in touch with the podcast and we can give you the address. John, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
Get well soon, Francis. I woke up on the floor this morning because my back was twinged after a heavy session of gardening and then on the rowing machine. I feel your pain, brother. My final thought is I've been following the discussion over the recent weeks, and I think that terminology that NATO is next, that Russia will pull itself out of this war, regroup quickly, and then invade NATO territory. And this therefore justifies the need of defence spending. Now, I wrote a thing for another member of the Telegraph family, the Spectator, where I said NATO I don't think is next. And I agree with Tony Radakin. I don't think Russia has the intent, capability and capacity for invading. Unfortunately, subsequently, the Director of National Intelligence agreed. She said it was almost certain that Russia would not directly attack NATO, but indirect activities are much more likely. Now, we've just seen Putin re-elected. Going back to Keane again, I think Putin is a malignant parasite who feeds on diseased tissues. Now, we can discuss whether it's 2.5%, 3%, whatever, 5% of GDP you spend on defence. But I think without resolve, confidence, morale and purpose at home, it won't matter how much we spend. Ultimately, our security will depend on the health and vigor of our own societies. So I say it's time for less talk and more action.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 PM London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.